This is Maura Raja from Pennez. I'm sitting here with Maura Garcia, a dancer and choreographer who collaborates within communities to create stories of identity and place. How are you, Maura?
I'm very well, thank you, and I'm very glad to be here.
Glad to have you. So I kind of wanted to start out with asking you what inspired you to be a choreographer? What stories are you trying to tell, and what moves you?
Yes, well, thank you. Thank you for asking that. I'm glad to be here today, glad to see you today. I just wanted to say that I started dancing as a child, so I've always danced for most of my life and danced other people's choreography and performed other people's choreography, but I didn't really start creating my own choreography until maybe around 2006, 7, 8, like around those times. And the need came because I had something to say. I had a particular storyline that I wanted to talk about through dance, and no one was saying it. So I thought, okay, well, I'm going to say it. So and I think I had this desire to create work or say something through work, but hadn't been told that I could be a choreographer. I hadn't been trained to be a choreographer, and so I thought, oh, well, that is something somebody else does. But when there came a point that I had a specific personal event in my life, and I wanted to create a dance about that. Mm-hmm. I wanted to express gratitude through this particular dance, and there was no one else that could say that. So I said, well, I've got to create movement that's specific for me to express this.
So a personal story.
Mm-hmm. And so it came out of a need in a way.
Mm-hmm. So Maura here is indigenous. She is Cherokee and
Mattamuskeet.
Mattamuskeet, yes. So a lot of your culture influences your dancing, right?
Yes. And so when people ask me, what is your style, or what kind of dance do you do? It's I wonder sometime. I don't know that there's a name necessarily to describe it. I say contemporary indigenous performance because that could be a category, but it doesn't actually mean about the technique. And so my cultural background, my family stories, so traditional stories, family stories, and life stories are what influence my work and the actual movements. Also the story of activity, the story of ceremony, and the story of routine. So for example, I might have a movement that's based on the way that you have to sift through hominy when you've washed it with lye water, and to get the little black tips off. There's a movement that you need to do to with that material, and so that might be a basis for a dance, or the way that you pat down seeds when you're planting, or the way that you shape clay. The movement of our ceremonies, not recreating ceremony on stage, nothing like that, but the way that we move in our dances and our traditional dances. So those are the things that I pull from.
So there's so much detail in all the different moves. They don't just come about. They all come from something. Every little move has its own background story.
Yeah, it's interesting that you said that. So yes and no. Mm-hmm. So sometimes. And I do this on purpose. Sometimes it is that way. There is one of my pieces called Awishkanshkotli, which means the other person is always planting. And so I specifically created in different ways for that. One was to look at, for example, the elements that are involved with planting, the elements that the sun and the earth and water and wind, and how all of these things are necessary for planting. And one was to, what is my relationship with the sun? What is the relationship with all of Earth with the sun? I had music created by Mark Gabriel Little. Shout out to my music maker, who also happens to be my little brother. So he created the music, and then I created dance in response to that music. But it had an original story to begin with, and then it was translated to the music, and then I responded to the music. But sometimes I create the other way around. Well, I'll be working with a story, like a traditional story, and let's say in the story 7 men went here. Well, how do I recreate that? Okay, and they did this movement. Well, what does that look like? So I might be, each movement and each transition may have a specific little story also. So both ways I like to create.
So can you enlighten us on a specific performance and what the story entailed and what you wanted the audience to take from your performance?
Yeah. Well, just with dance and with stories, and there's obviously so many different ways to tell a story.
Yeah.
Someone once said to me, the best performance is where your lights, your costume, the quality of movement, the props, and everything is telling the same story. So, I'm always interested in making sure that the audience is hearing what I'm saying, but I also don't want to hit them over the head with it or assume that I don't want to assume that they don't know something, because they come with lots of knowledge, but they also may not know what story I'm telling. They may have no clue. So it's the challenge in that is, one, not hitting your audience over the head, but two, understanding that if you have a story with so much background and so much depth, the audience may have no reference point. So how do you get across in a performance of an hour, 2 hours, all of this information?
Right.
And sorry, I started talking about that. What was the original question again?
I guess I can be more specific. So I know you had a show recently, and it was full moon dances, and you kind of took the audience through a series of different moments.
Yes.
And there was a part where you kind of mimicked a baby bird looking for a place to go.
Is that the one, Finding Yourself?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so that one, yes. So the broad, with a lot of pieces, there's a bigger story and a smaller story, as in all stories, right? You have the story arc, and then you might have little personal stories. So with this dance performance, I collaborated with Chico Sierra, who is a poet-musician, and so it was a story of a relationship between two people, and the story of the ups and downs of this relationship, and also looking at, we say people are in a relationship, but they're two separate beings, and so what separate paths people may be on in their lives, and how that pulls them together and pulls them farther apart. In that particular piece, it was about someone who's finding themselves, because if you're in a relationship with somebody else and you're busy finding yourself, that may or may not bring you closer. It actually might bring you farther apart. But there's lots of seriousness about finding yourself, and I thought, but it's also kind of funny. That's you're right here, right? And so I thought about when sometimes we're always thinking we have to be something different or do something different to find ourselves, and what's more different than birds or than a bear or things that are so different from us. And so it's looking seriously at going to find yourself, but also kind of making fun of it. And okay, to find myself, I am going to be like a bird, and to find, this is what I'm going to do, and then putting on ram. It was like ram fur. Is what that was, and I did have some feathers too. But just the idea, okay, I'm going to go find myself. I'm going to be this animal. I'm going to have to put on this animal skin, and now I'm going to walk like this animal. And it's funny, because if you actually try to do those movements, we obviously can only do them so well, because we're humans. So that was the story behind that. And what I hoped that the audience would take from it is, if they got all of that storyline, if they thought about it and discussed it, fine, but also just kind of laughing at ourselves and the idea of finding yourself to have some humor in that.
So what is a favorite story that you've told?
I have lots of stories. Well, I think one of the stories recently that's also in Awishkanshkotwe, the piece that I was telling, is the story of Daughter of the Sun. It's a traditional story. It's a Cherokee story. I'm not going to tell it here because it's a long story. But it has to do has many lessons in it. It has a lot to do with balance, the power of the sun, that you have something so powerful that if we do not have it, we, along with most life, unless it's some type of organism on the bottom of the sea, would die. But we also, if you spend too much time in the sun, you get burned. If you look directly at the sun for a long time, you'll go blind.
Right. So
this whole idea of being completely dependent upon something that's so powerful, so you have to walk with it in balance. So that's maybe even the moral or the one of the teachings behind the story. But with this particular story, there's lots of action involved, and there are lots of, you have all of society involved, and people going on a journey, and people coming back, and actually people not succeeding, failing, but then things turning out okay. So I think that's what's fascinating to me about that particular story.
So I'm kind of curious about the creative process, because you're able to speak about it, but then you're also able to perform and create choreography to resonate with the audience about the specific story. How does that come about? How do you match each movement with what you're saying, and where does it start? Does it start with the story or the dance, or
Oh, that's a good question. I had the chance to go to a residency in Vancouver in December. Our instructor was Charles Coronejo. He was Maori, which is another group of indigenous people, but in New Zealand. And he talked to us about this. It was supposedly a great debate that happened over several days, and I think it was in Japan, and it was whether or not and I might mess this story up if he ever listens to this, I'm sorry, but whether or not was it the process, the content, or the process. I think those are the two. So whether or not you came up with the content first and then started creating, or you started creating and then the content came about.
Right.
And I don't know. I think they did not agree. And there's two ways of looking at that. And he challenged us to think, how do you create? And I think a lot of the times I have something specific I'm thinking about. It'll usually be something that is bothering me. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but it's kind of this nagging thing that keeps on reoccurring, a story and a story and a story. And, I want to talk about this. What is the story of planting? What is the story of putting seeds in the ground and having them grow? What is the story of this land in Kansas City, Missouri? I haven't done a piece about that necessarily, and so it'll just keep on reoccurring, and I'll start thinking of movements that might have to do with that particular story, and sometimes it'll come together all at once. Sometimes I'll work on them in the studio and leave them there and then revisit them. And so, I don't know if that kind of answers your question.
Oh, no, definitely. Yeah. Definitely. So there isn't one direct answer. It's kind of it just happens, what inspires you or how...
Well, so with dance, it's important to do some exploration. So when you're doing... exploration, for example, and I could go into detail about different exercises that you might do, like walking fast, walking slow, walking high, walking low. When you do those explorations, something that makes you want to explore further will usually come out, right? Maybe you have an exploration. I did, for example, in the studio yesterday, I was oozing around on the floor for 40 minutes, okay? And so, but part of the exploration was, what happens if I have to move sideways? I can only move sideways on the floor, which is very tiring, by the way. And so how am I going to get across the floor? Okay, what if I have to move away from that object? And so when you do those things, which may sound strange, at the end of it, you've come out with this movement. This is the movement. If I am in life and I have to move away from something sideways, well, that's what this looks like. And so in order to not always be doing the same thing over and over, which is, we could all easily fall into, no matter what your art is, if you kind of doing these explorations and making yourself do stuff that might be new or uncomfortable, that helps the process.
Yeah, because your choreography, your dance techniques are very different. I don't think I've ever seen anything like it before. There's so much. They're a lot more powerful.
Oh, and thank you.
Yeah, I was on. It was beautiful to watch, and I could tell that there was a lot of thought with each movement. That you weren't just, moving with the sound. You were telling a story essentially with each movement. And I thought that was something that resonated with me.
Another source of inspiration is not just in the studio, also, but like this. I have a piece that's going to premiere on the 21st and 22nd. It's part of I'm an artist in residence at the Lawrence Art Center. So, as part of that residency, I'm presenting us a short piece at their ballet show. It's not a ballet at all. It's not ballet. Just clarify that. But one of the movements came from a little boy that was doing a 1, 2, 3 hop step. He was just, I saw this child, and he was concentrating. First he was walking, and he just looked like he was concentrating, and all of a sudden he just started doing this 1, 2, 3 hop, 1, 2, 3 hop, and he passed his hands underneath his leg. And I was like, what is that kid doing? That's so neat looking. So I just watched this little boy, and I said, I hope you don't mind, little boy, I'm going to steal that, But the movements that people sometimes are doing, 2-year-olds have wonderful movement, because they're just completely without caring of technique or anybody else for that matter, Birds, watching, for example, a bunch of buzzards, how they, all sit on poles, or so there's all types of movement that is not in the studio that just happens. There's dance going on, all around us, and to take from that also and borrow from that.
Yeah. That's beautiful. Would you do the honor of sharing an excerpt of a poem that you've written?
Yes, I will. So this poem, if you recall, I talked about the process of thinking about our relationship with the sun, and so this was a poem created from that thought. It's called Ode to the Sun. How we need the sun and earth and wind. Absence makes us sick. Sitting in our shoddy boxes, we think castles. We imagine we forget, but our spirits don't forget. Dry tears running, waiting for us to go outside, waiting for us to come home.
Beautiful.
That was beautiful.
Thank you. And so that is the beginning of a piece also. So that poem is performed live before a dance that corresponds to music that also corresponds to Ode to the Sun.
Oh, okay.
And so the music was created with the idea of rays coming up like the sunrise, and then the dance corresponds to the lines in the poem.
Yeah. What inspired this story? How did it all start?
Vitamin D deficiency.
Really?
I'm serious. Several things. Vitamin D deficiency, the fact that I plant also, wanting to make work about planting, wanting to honor some of my family who had passed on and their stories about planting, and also wanting to work in workshops with other people with different Native communities. And so I felt there's so many things I always forget to talk about when someone interviews me, but one of the other ways I created in this process was about place. So stories of place. I think you mentioned that at the beginning. And so I held a series of workshops, one in the Kansas City Indian Center, one at my house in DeSoto, one in Vancouver, and there's somewhere else I'm forgetting right at the moment. But they were, and what we dealt with in the workshops were, where were we born? where our tribal homelands are, so the homelands of our tribe, which for some people that's not the same, they weren't born in the same place, and then where we live now. And so people create, the workshops were free. Oh, and the other one was for the First Nations Student Association at University of Kansas. So the workshops, were free, but I asked the people, I said, can I use some of what you share to create choreography? So, and that's how some of the choreography was created, to share these folks' stories and of place via choreography. And so,
it's very complex. You can take something so simple and just expand it.
And it's interesting about that, though. As an artist, one has to realize that I can have that understanding of the meaning, but the reality is, unless someone is in my head, they are not going to know what that means. They may only take part of it. So that's why I think it's important to be specific and have those matching the music and the lights and the costume, because you want them to at least take some of it. They're not going to take the whole story. That's just not possible, unless they had an interview and read something and then went and saw the piece,
right.
Which gets probably to be like work after a while. I don't know. But this is a story that Liz Lehrman, I'm going to probably misquote her, but I'm going to paraphrase. So Liz Lehrman is a very well-known dance artist and philosopher based out of D.C., but she said that you can relate to the story of choreography or in dance in three ways. There's like different levels. So she said she was in a building, and she looked out of the window and she saw a bunch of children playing, and the kids were flopping around. And she was like, wow, that looks really cool. That's a very neat looking movement. That's fascinating. So she wanted to find out what they were doing and why, so she walked down the stairs and went outside. And when she went outside, she saw that the children were by a pond and that fish had come out of the pond and they were flopping around. And so the children were flopping around imitating the fish. So then she understood what they were imitating. And then in that moment, she started having memories about when she used to go fishing with her father. And that made her, that brought another sense to her. And so she said, if you're lucky at some point in a performance, you will hit someone on one of those levels. I mean, when you're really lucky, it might be all three. That's,
Wow.
Yeah. So I think about that a lot. And then realize that sometimes it may be just someone will see, that looks really neat. That might be all that they're seeing, So, which sometimes is okay.
I think it's amazing that you're able to find inspiration in just, daily common tasks, just anything. You're able to see it and make something out of it. That's what art is all about. It's beautiful.
Well, people are very interesting. And lots of interesting things going on.
So, you're putting yourself out there on stage and you're telling a personal story, but you're also allowing the audience to give their own opinions, to allow their own interpretations. So how does that affect you as an artist? Does it...
I'm laughing because I'm thinking of a specific thing.
Because it makes you so vulnerable in a sense. How do you handle that? How do you go about it? Does it empower you?
Yeah, actually, talking is more scary to me. Once you're on the stage and performing, then I don't feel vulnerable in that way, actually.
Wow.
Actually, okay, when there's been a wardrobe malfunction, sometimes, yes, I have felt, I'm like, oh no. But I feel I'm not ever dancing by myself, even if there are not other humans, with me. I have the ones who came before me that are dancing with me. And so I think it's very empowering to perform. Now, people's interpretations and reviews and all of those things are always very interesting. And I've told my story once I've performed. I know that because there's some things they're just not going to understand, and that's okay. I just hope it has affected them in a good way. But I do remember one time I created choreography based very specifically on stories of interviews. This was with the Charleston Library Society.
Mm-hmm.
And so I interviewed this is a private library, started in 17-something in Charleston, South Carolina. I think it was still started when, it might have been 1760, because the British, the colonies, sorry, I'm hungry. The colonies were based out of, their headquarters were based in Charleston for that area. And so they had this private library, very exclusive, very beautiful, and it's still a library that you have to pay to be a part of. So it's a private library, old school. And I interviewed the constituents of this library and made the music even used parts of their interviews. We also used parts of the story, Nachi creation story, because that's one of the nations that are indigenous to that area, with permission, just put that out there, to use not their full stories, but just excerpts from their stories, and and then the choreography was based on that. So there was one movement that I did where I had my hand in the air, and so afterwards, one woman said, "That just reminded me. Did that have to do with the lynchings that went on?" And I was like, "Did you?" I just looked at her for a while and I said, "Did you read the program?" I didn't say that, but in my mind I was thinking, some things are, you can take however you want. But I do remember being slightly annoyed because that was very specific. The whole piece was about those people's stories. So. But there's nothing you can do about that. Maybe it made her think, and maybe she's gonna, I don't know, write a book about the atrocities and stuff. Something good hopefully will come of it. Right. but it did make me laugh because I thought, you did not pay attention.
Right. What is one thing that you always want your audience to take away?
I think that I would hope that they would be given energy, and that they would be somehow inspired in their own lives. If that's the broadest thing, for different performances or different stories, I may have different pieces of information or ideas that I would hope, but really I hope that the energy and the spirit that comes through me when I perform, or that is in the choreography, I hope that it comes out of me and reaches them. That is my desire for any performance and story that I'm conveying.
That's awesome.
To me, kind of the reason that's the purpose of dancing. Should be the purpose of speaking, but we don't always. Doesn't always work because we talk so much.
Thank you for your time, Maura. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, and I'm very glad to be here.